Well, welcome to Round the Table Live with Christian Concern. And today we are talking about financial censorship, which appears to be a relatively new thing, but an emerging thing and affecting more and more people. It's been in the media a lot this week. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Mike Davidson of Core Issues Trust and Dr. Joe Boot of Ezra Institute. Thank you so much for joining us, guys. Great to have you with us. Mike, I'm going to start with you because your story is one of the first stories of this financial censorship here in the UK. You had two charities whose accounts were closed, very short notice, no explanation from Barclays Bank. Tell us the story. What happened to you, Mike?
So Core Issues Trust is a charity. IFTCC is not, but it's a registered, distinct legal entity.
Okay.
In July 2020, 13th of that month, I received two letters to say that the banks were closing the accounts and that we had 2 months' notice. They gave a telephone number which I called and asked for a reason, and they declined to give any reason, and that was the end of the conversation. And then I sought legal advice. But this had followed probably 3 weeks of a sustained initiative on the part of Pride in Lockdown, who apparently had been encouraged to target Core Issues Trust as a charity registered in Northern Ireland and to see its end. So we'd received many, many phone calls, 300. It's all been documented, all then in subsequent reports to the Charity Commission, everything is outlined there. Much material sent in our direction that really was very horrible to deal with. So that really brought us into a position.
And then you got compensation.
We got compensation.
You got compensation.
We got compensation following legal action by the Christian Legal Centre, who represented us, an amount of 21.5 thousand, which really, I guess, is arbitrary. But the interesting thing is that it was more than we asked for. And we're very thankful, actually, that we got something, but that wasn't the point. You know, this is a principled investigation that we wanted to have take place, but we had to jump through the hurdles of Barclays Bank continually accusing us of bringing our case to the wrong forum. So there were territorial disputes. The account was opened in Northern Ireland. The charity is registered in Northern Ireland. But Barclays Bank said we should be bringing the case in London because that's where the IFTCC is registered. But fortunately, in their attempt to throw out the case, the judge, the county court judge in Belfast, was having nothing of that, and the case wasn't thrown out, and he refused to accept what Barclays was saying. It was then referred to the High Court, and it was while we were awaiting that Barclays made, I think, 2 other offers and suggested that they would be willing to accept an offer. We were very reluctant at first and had to weigh it up very carefully. I think in the end, we felt it was actually going to potentially cost a great deal of money. And if we did get a principled, win, it would be overshadowed by the cost of actually bringing the action. So it was a shame that we couldn't speak about the substantive issues, but we felt, we'd done what we could to raise the issue and to object to what was happening.
Well done for that, Mike, and fantastic to get that conversation, which is kind of an acknowledgement that your case at least had a strong case there, I think, from Barclays, although they didn't admit any liability or any guilt on it. And Joe, this has now become a major news item, not just because of Mike, but Nigel Farage and various others have also said that they've suffered financial discrimination like that. What do you think? Is this a growing issue? How do you see it developing this?
Yes, it is. It is something that seems to have come up, especially in the last sort of 18 months, really. I know that there are people coming out of the woodwork now where we're hearing about things that have happened over the last 2 or 3 years. But in recent months, there seems to have been a glut of instances where we're seeing what I would describe really as a weaponizing of the financial institutions against cultural conservatives, against free speech, against Christians, basically, as well. In particular, we've got the case of in the north of England, Yorkshire Building Society, for example, and a vicar who wrote into the Building Society to express concern about the festooning of their website with various.
I think he was actually responding to a customer survey, Joe.
Was he really?
Yes, he was actually responding to customer feedback.
That's incredible. I didn't know that part of it. I didn't see that in the articles that I read, but obviously I've been following and tracking with these particular stories. I mean, and that's astonishing. They're even asking for the feedback. You give it, and then a few days later, your account is closed down. Now, those aren't coincidences. What's happened with things like PayPal?
Yeah, it's a customer survey. They asked for feedback. He gave feedback, which included they wasn't happy with them promoting transgender ideology and pride and stuff like that, and then found out that they then notified him his account was being closed with no explanation. When other people have written in to ask why is it being closed, they've said we don't close accounts of people, for lots of different reasons, only if they're actually discriminatory or something like that. Which I presume they think that he's discriminatory. He hasn't actually discriminated against anyone. The only person that's been discriminated against is him.
Yeah.
By the bank.
Yeah. And this is highly dangerous because obviously we've seen the censorship happening through big tech, including some of these payment providers.
Yeah.
If it starts to happen in banks, and I expect we'll discuss this a bit later in the program, but we're talking about people's ability to function in life. And this is a tremendous threat. You can see how this would have a tremendous potential to basically have people self-censor even more than they are if they feel that they articulate in the workplace or to their financial institution or even a post on social media concerns about essentially this critical theory, cultural Marxism penetrating our society at this level. They're going to be afraid that their accounts are going to be shut down, and the implications for that for people are incredibly serious. Nigel Farage's case, which of course has had a lot of media coverage in the last few days, has extended to 3 members of his immediate family, and then apparently approaching, I think now up to 9 banks, which refused to offer him the suite of accounts necessary for the functioning of his life and work. And I think that the fact that this is now getting attention from the government is critically important, because the potential for persecution here of dissenting voices is almost communist China in terms of the scale of potential. We're talking really about, this really would be, if this was allowed to continue, a backdoor entry of a social credit system into the Western democracies.
Yeah. And Mike, your case obviously got a lot of profile. I think it was mentioned on a front page headline article of the Daily Telegraph this week. How do the banks get away with this? I mean, part of what there's been discussed here is politically exposed persons, which Nigel Farage would presumably count as that, but you wouldn't count as a politically exposed person. Neither would a vicar. Vicar Richard Fothergill either. So how do they possibly justify closing account of you or a vicar because of what seems like what you said?
Well, I don't think they need to justify it. They feel that they're in the right. They're taking the moral high ground. From my point of view, I see this as the fruit of Stonewall's activity. Stonewall I see as the root, sap, and source of issues relating to free speech violations and other violations. They have been unchecked for decades. And I realize there's been some backtracking, even the BBC. Yes. And yet, of course, they've migrated in other directions. They're not really very far away, as I understand it, from where they were with Stonewall. Yeah. So I think this is very much the consequence of an era where Stonewall had pretty well free reign. And the worry is what we have seen here is the destruction.
And just to make clear, Mike, so it's been found that nearly all the banks are members of Stonewall diversity schemes, even now, after all of the backlash that Stonewall had about its promotion of transgender ideology. So Stonewall, it appears, and probably the banks have Stonewall activists in them, and that this is clearly an influential organization on the banks.
And my worry is my present banker, we had to eventually find another banker. The present group that we're with is also a member of the Stonewall Champion group.
Right.
And I have an email in my box to which I must respond by Monday with, I think, 12 questions. And I need to respond with evidence in terms of who my customers are, who are my providers. It's a very worrying time. But if I may mention, my concern is what we have seen because of Stonewall is the closure of ideological diversity. We now have this monoculture in Great Britain, this state ideology that we all need to bow down to. And if we don't, this is the consequence. This is horrendous. And it's such a subtle thing that has crept up on us. Where is it going to end?
Yes. Well, yes, we don't know where it will end. But Joe, you had some experience in Canada. You were in Canada up until last year, weren't you? And there was some closure of accounts in Canada around the lockdown period. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually, off the back of what Mike was saying. I think it was the philosopher Chantal Dessol that talked about our age being the age of the end of ideology. And by that, she meant that we've reached a point where there is only one ideology permitted. And it's increasingly being enforced. So ironically, you end up with the end of ideology. Everything closes ranks. Now, in the Canadian landscape, a couple of stories I think would be interesting to our viewers and listeners. The first is, of course, the famous trucker convoy protests that happened in Canada. Now, if memory serves, it was the winter of 2022. And in the end, what happened there it was a completely peaceful, essentially protest, free speech demonstration involving ordinary working people from across the country who drove their trucks and vans to the capital and staged a sit-in. It was like a sort of fete or festival. It was outdoor barbecues and candy floss and children and bouncy castles and all this kind of thing. I went to take a look at it twice myself to see what was going on. And the pressure that they were applying in terms of trying to push back against the monoculture, the mono narrative that was surrounding the lockdown. In the end, what the Trudeau government did was to invoke essentially the War Powers Act, an Emergency Measures Act, which has been renamed. and invoked that in order that the federal government could do a number of things, but one of which was seize the bank accounts of those involved, or organizers, people with their vehicles there. But it also happened that some people who had donated as little as $10 or $20 to the protest through the GoFundMe page had their bank accounts frozen as well. Now, GoFundMe itself, this was another illustration of big tech essentially cooperating with big government and engaging in censorship and the weaponization of their financial services. Is they basically they held on to millions of dollars. And in the end, the government froze about $6.1 million of money in people's accounts. And this was all part of, you can imagine the intimidation and the threat of that. You're trying to provide for your family, pay your mortgage, put gas in your tank. You're a small business person, part of the convoy, or you are just a regular Canadian, because they had massive support across the country. Suddenly your bank account's frozen. You go into a grocery store, at least the ones that the state allowed to be opened, and you find that your card is declined. That's what was going on. And actually, contrary to what many people think, what ended that was not simply the banks deciding spontaneously to start unfreezing accounts. It was because hundreds of millions of dollars being held in Canadian banks started to leave Canadian shores. And the banks spoke to the federal government, and they panicked and ended the Emergency Act very, very quickly, because people were losing trust became afraid that their assets could be randomly seized in Canada. So get your assets out. So this was that's not what you typically find in the popular media, but in the end, it was pressure of people withdrawing money from Canada, money fleeing Canada, that led to the lifting of that, and eventually people's accounts were opened. So that was the big story that many people will be broadly familiar with, where you can actually see big government, increasingly an authoritarian government, in bed with financial institutions, working together to weaponize the financial system against ordinary people. But we ourselves as an organization, and I can't name the institutions on this program, but in the Canadian landscape, our own organization, after having engaged a major accountancy firm to do some business for us, a few weeks in, after they started exploring our organization and our materials, refused us financial services on ideological grounds. And then more recently, in a major financial transaction to do with an asset sale, an individual wanting to do business with us had their financial services, a particular financial service, declined on the basis that they were going to do business with us. So we weren't even the client. Somebody else was the client, and they were being declined business because indirectly this person would be engaged with us. So both from the sort of macro level in the Canadian landscape, and then at the micro level, Mike talking about, core issues, trust. This kind of thing is happening to charities and Christian organizations around the Western world, being declined basic financial services and having to hunt around all over the place to find people willing to help you.
Wow, that's absolutely shocking, Joe. I mean, it's just, that hopefully that is not a picture of where we're going in the UK, but, it looks terrifying like it might be where we're going. But what we have at the moment is a government that is saying, no, this should not happen. And institutions understand they might abolish the politically exposed persons regulations, which is from the EU, which we've done Brexit, we can get out of that. And they might force banks to protect free speech. Mike, what would you like to see the government do in relation to this?
I think the government should be respecting the authority, for example, of the Charity Commission. If the
Right.
Charity Commission has accepted a group as a legitimate organization that is there for the public good, then those values should be reinforced. It cannot be allowed to be undermined by a bank under the guise of commercial reasons that they always cite. There's something very wrong here. But I also think we have to look at memberships that these banks have of various United Nations initiatives. Mm-hmm. So there are various United Nations initiatives, and Barclays Bank and certainly the Yorkshire Bank that you have referred to in this podcast are both members. I've just forgotten the name of it, but I have it.
Trigonometry.
I don't know if that one belongs to it as well, but these are United Nations initiatives that have gender targets and are, steeped in this whole critical theory approach to understanding reality. So I think the government needs to look at that as well. Just as we saw the influence of the United Nations in sex education and how it's, making its inroads into various countries in different ways, there are links that I think are causing problems within the country that we need to look at very carefully.
Yeah. Joe, there's a question from a viewer here on Facebook, Kenny Barry, who says, excellent, interesting discussion, but do you see us winning this battle? What's your view, Joe, on that?
Actually, on this one, I do. In the UK, at least, I'm optimistic about where this public discussion is going to go, and partly because of some of the pushback that we're seeing in other sectors. And I think Mike's point is also a very interesting one. If the Charity Commission has already, as an arm really of government, has already approved a given charity, what business has a bank got stepping in and denying them basic services? But if you look at, for example, in the whole area of sport and the way there is significant pushback against this radical ideology in athletics and in various other areas in the UK in education, we're seeing some pushback. I feel that at the moment, there is a real opportunity here to maybe see off before it gets too big of an issue, this particular threat. Of course, I could be wrong. Maybe I've got too much faith here in common sense. But I do feel at the minute that there is enough profile and enough concern around this issue, I think, of ordinary people, and with the help actually now of some significant conservative media like GB News and others, that this is entirely unacceptable. Now, in terms of how government should respond to some of this, as somebody who really does believe in a very limited role for the state in the various aspects of life and the fundamental principles of sphere sovereignty, I'm not one to generally advocate for government interference and government intervention in private areas. However, the banks are already heavily regulated and, in my view, massively over regulated. And as, again, Mike alluded to, part of the problem here is that policies that are introduced either via the EU or the UN or other policy requirements of financial institutions, regulations, are part of what puts pressure on these institutions to discriminate in this way. So that there is, I think, already excessive regulation. We need more competition in the banking sector, and the excessive regulation prevents competition entering the market. So it's an incredibly difficult journey for new banks to actually emerge. In fact, I think there's only been one or two in the last number of decades that have actually been able to emerge in this heavily regulated environment. So that doesn't actually help. However, because of where we've come to now culturally, with the way currency works, with the way people's lives work, the way where we've come to technologically and digitally, it really becomes, as I mentioned earlier, impossible to function without a bank account.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, you can't even stay at a hotel, remember, without a credit card. It's really come to a point, and increasingly various groups won't even accept cash. And I know that's a topic we're coming to in just a second. But the simple fact is that without a bank account, I think Nigel Farage says, you're practically reduced to being a non-person. And there's a lot of truth to that. It is almost impossible to function in an ordinary life, to pay your bills, to receive your salary and all those things without an account. Now, if that's the case, maybe an FCA procedure is insufficient. I think we could start with those sorts of investigations, but we may actually get to the point where we need to say, no, banks are like utility providers. Everybody needs to have legal access, unless there is criminality involved or fraud, and plenty of laws already cover those issues. Then everybody should be entitled to hold a bank account so that they can exist and function. And so,
I think you're entitled to sort of services from utilities like water and gas,
precisely,
and so on, because banking's now become an essential service to survive, to pay for things, and so on. Has been for a long time, really. It ought to be regulations say everyone's entitled to a bank account of some kind. And I think Nigel Farage made reference to, in days gone by, the post office was required to give everybody a bank account. I mean, obviously that was state-owned at the time. Not anymore, but it seems like we may need new regulation to make that clear to the banks at this point. Mike?
Can you imagine if the government were to proceed with its so-called ban on conversion therapy at this point? The terrain of the banking world is going to contribute to a massive set of difficulties, I would say, in the country. So hopefully they will look very carefully at what they're doing before they come forward with this proposed legislation.
Yeah, well, the proposed legislation is due out any day now, so we will see what happens on that one, and we're praying hard about it, and we'll be very keen to respond as soon as it comes out there. Mike, you had like 72,000 people sign a petition to Barclays Bank supporting you in this. I think the Times reported that there are 9,000 people who are members of a Facebook group, NatWest Close My Account. Yours wasn't NatWest, but it seems to be rather more common than you might have thought. What would you encourage Christians to do in response to what we're hearing about here?
Well, all credit to Citizen Go, who was responsible for that survey and getting 72,000 people to sign it. We were very grateful, and it was very helpful. If you look at the comments on the Times article that triggered all of this, you'll notice how many people very angrily said that they would be closing their accounts in Barclays. They were furious about this. So I think there is happily momentum there. One anecdote that I'd just like to mention is, in the course of the media work that was done in preparation for this, the BBC correspondent in Northern Ireland came back saying that she would ask whether or not the BBC would be allowed to report on this. And I thought, well, doesn't that say it all? Here we are.
The BBC is allowed to report. Allowed to report. That's extraordinary.
Well, I stand to be corrected, but it was in that spirit. It was startling and frightening, I would say.
Wow. So, Joe, you've hinted at this. We're going to a cashless society at the moment. So we virtually are already in a cashless society. There are a lot of places already that don't accept cash. And you need a credit card to do lots of different things, or a debit card. How should Christians respond to this? What should be a Christian perspective on the kind of society that we're living in now?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think where we're at is that we do, as Christians, Scripture says, live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil. And so we need to do those things, I think, which advance freedom in this area as much as possible for everybody. And I think that a diversity at this point of currency and a diversity of ways of being able to pay for things is incredibly important. We've never before, of course, in history had a time where people were proposing, because we've never had the technological ability, central banks having digital currencies, and all of people's financial transactions being monitored and potentially restricted. And so cash, I think, at the present time, legal tender is really, really important. I think that all of us, and listen, men, I think, are particularly bad at this. I think our wives are generally better at carrying cash, but I think we should carry cash. We should pay for what we can frequently, not all the time, but frequently pay for things with paper money, with coins, so that we are, as much as possible, are using these things. We're seeing banks actually closing ATMs around the country. We're seeing increasingly branches closing. It's not just that ATMs are closing. Actual access to dealing with human beings in a bank is becoming more and more difficult. And so actually being able to have discussions about your account with an account manager becoming more and more difficult. Everything is on apps and being done digitally. And so I think as much as possible, we need to preserve access to human beings with our banking. We need access to cash. I think we should be spending cash and using cash. I think that digital currencies are a double-edged sword. I think there's great potential for freedom in some of the cryptocurrencies. There's also a tremendous risk in centralized digital currencies that are obvious to any thinking person. So I think diversification for Christians is really important, not just for Christians, but for anybody who's concerned about freedom and liberty. And I think that is the Christian response. Jesus was able to send one of his disciples down to the lake and get the necessary coin for the tax out of a fish's mouth. I doubt most of us can send a family member down to the river to get the required tax to pay. But that was a good ATM. That ATM is not going to be available to most of us. We're going to have to use conventional means. And so finding liberated ways, as far as is possible, of spending currency that provide as maximum freedom as possible, I think is important. And that means diversification. I also think that we should, as believers, be thinking about Christian banks. I know there is one pretty well-established Christian bank, Kingdom Bank, in the UK. We need to support those banks. We need to use those banks. And I think that we also should be seeking to establish more banks. I watched a movie recently called Bank of Dave, which was based on a true story, fascinating story about a small private bank opening up. I think those are the kind of things that we need to be doing and insisting on, that there is more freedom in banking and in financial transactions. And it's vital at this point in time that we spend cash.
Mike, any closing comments from you?
No, I'm thinking of getting a very secure mattress and stuffing it very full of cash, depending on how my email goes on Monday with my bank, to see what they're going to do. I think it's worrying that Scripture talks about the night coming when no man can work. I trust and pray that isn't the case, and I'm thankful that the government is looking into this, but we're going to have to keep it very high on the profile and make sure that we are open about what is happening when things go wrong, and speaking up about this.
Gold is maybe another good thing to think through, Tim. Holding precious metal, making that part of portfolios. But I think that from a constructive point of view, this whole notion of new Christian institutions, financial services, payments, payment services, and banks really should be looked at by wealthy believers, and also just wealthy, freedom-loving people in this country.
Very good. Well, listen, that's been a fascinating discussion. Lots of insight there, lots of interesting points, lots of food for thought, I think, for us there, and lots to pray into. All is certainly not lost. I think the government reaction has been that they want to try and do stuff about this and clamp down or regulate the banks in whatever the right way is, and make sure proper explanations are given if they close accounts, which is obviously necessary. And we need to pray that is what happens, and that people are free to bank as they need to in this country, and you're free to use the money that they've saved and that they get paid and so on from working for it. Listen, thank you very much for joining us, both of you. Really appreciate your time and your wisdom in it. And thank you for watching and listening, and look forward to catching up again next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.